Good afternoon and welcome to today's Georgetown Alumni webinar hosted by the Georgetown University Alumni Association. Thank you for taking time out of your day to connect virtually with fellow Hoyas for today's conversation, The Psychic Hold of Slavery, Why Slavery Still Matters, with Georgetown alumni and faculty Soyica Diggs Colbert and Robert Patterson. I'm Kelly Young, Associate Director of Strategic Engagement in Alumni Relations, and I'll be facilitating today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few tips and reminders. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel within 48 hours of today's broadcast. You will receive a link to the recording in our follow-up email. Soyica and Robert will refer to a digital handout, an article titled The Case for Reparations. This article can be found and downloaded from the handouts section of your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll also share a link to the article within our post-webinar email. Soyica and Robert will answer questions towards the end of the discussion. Please send in your questions using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. If you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, please also submit those concerns to me via the question section of that control panel. Without any further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Professor Colbert and Professor Patterson.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks so much for having us into the Georgetown alumni community. Thank you for having us.
And we're looking forward to the conversation today that we're going to have, which is actually happening at a pretty somber moment as the memorial in Minneapolis for George Floyd is currently underway. And so perhaps before the end of this, or even now, we could just take maybe 30 seconds as a moment of silence to commemorate his life and his legacy. Thank you for joining us for that important moment, not only because of what it symbolized, but also because of just the significance of the gravity of the time that we're living in, and how when we agreed to do this seminar, let me just say, every time we agree to do this seminar, it seems to have more and more resonances to what's going on in a contemporary moment, but we'll get to that. So we've already welcomed you. We want to take a brief second to introduce each other, to outline our plan for the discussion this afternoon, and then of course to end with questions that we'll be able to take that you might have. So to my left, I guess, which is as she appears on my screen, is Soyica Diggs Colbert. She is the class of 2001. She currently is the Idle Family Professor in the College of Arts and Sciences. She's also a professor of African American Studies and Performing Arts. She is the author of several books, but the one that I'm going to highlight today is Black Movements. And I also actually going to highlight two. She has a forthcoming biography on Lorraine Hansberry, which we're very excited about. And of course, we're the co-editors of The Psychic Hold of Slavery, Legacies, and American Expressive Culture.
And to my right on my screen is Robert J. Patterson. He is college class of 2002. He is a professor in African American Studies and is the author of Exodus Politics, as well as Destructive Desires, and is also obviously the co-author of The Psychic Hold of Slavery, and is currently working on a book project that thinks about racial equity and the idea of racial equity versus equality, which I'm sure will come up during today's discussion.
So part of how we want to get started is we want to talk about the origins of the psychic hold of slavery, the issues that we were thinking about, give you some of the arguments that we make in the different chapters with our contributors, and then really laser focus in on how those arguments are relevant today, particularly in this moment of not only COVID-19, police brutality, the widening gap of economic inequality among Black communities, and we could enumerate the list. So we began to think about the psychic hold of slavery in maybe 2014, 2015. So go ahead, so we can talk about what the projects we were wrapping up and how we got to that point.
Right. So we were both finishing our first books, and we were thinking about the landscape of the world we were living in. And at that time, obviously, was the age of Obama. And so we were struck by the coincidence of having the first Black president and also having this spate of killings, including the death of Trayvon Martin and many others that were animating the public discourse. And so around that time, Henry Louis Gates said, and we quote this in the book, that it was the best of times and the worst of times for Black people. We had a Black president, and we also had the highest rate of Black incarceration, Black male incarceration in the history of the world. And so we were trying to come to terms with the coincidence of these events. And I would just say that one of the things that we've been struck by is how these dynamics have continued to be animated, obviously from 2016 to the present, and certainly I would argue have been accelerated since 2016. And so the conversation we were trying to stage, which was really about how our current moment was related to the history and legacies of slavery, I think has even more resonance, obviously, for, in regard to the past 9 days and certainly the past 3.5 years under our current person in the White House.
So if we had put a poll up, we would ask, what do you think happened in 2016 that accelerated these issues? And there's probably one answer that would be on the poll. And so, in all due seriousness, so we wanted to think about slavery and its legacies. And we wanted to really pull at two questions when we first sat down to think about the book, to think about its contours, and the arguments that we wanted to flesh out. And so the two questions that animate the book are, why can't Black people get over slavery, right? And what would it mean to get over slavery, right? And these are questions that are important because they assume that slavery actually can't be gotten over, right? So it's the interesting thing, the question itself, it doesn't necessarily assume it, but the question itself calls into question whether or not one could ever get over slavery, right? So what would getting over slavery look like? And we were particularly struck by that because in addition to the state of killings that were happening at the hand of law enforcement and citizens who decided to act as certain forms of law enforcement, there was a turn in Black expressive culture to the institution of slavery. So we're thinking about, Django Unchained. We're thinking about 12 Years a Slave, the cinematic adaptation of the emancipatory narrative. So we're thinking about why in Black expressive culture and perhaps American popular culture more generally, are people returning to this institution of slavery and what can be gained from it? So the question, why can't Black people get over slavery? It raises several points that we thought were worth interrogating. One of those points is, what would it mean to quote unquote get over slavery? If, for example, we argue that we stop representing slavery, talking about slavery, having webinars that discuss slavery's impacts, would that all of a sudden diminish the impact or the effects of slavery and its legacy? So we think that the answer to that question is absolutely not, but that is something that we wanted to interrogate. Not only is the answer no, but we force ourselves and our fellow contributors to explain why that actually is the case, that we can't necessarily get over slavery. And then we had to really think energetically about why and in what specific material ways does the institution of slavery still matter? And what ways do we see tangibly, right? So if we trace the economics back to the point where we could go back and say, for example, slavery led to Jim Crow segregation, and that the redlining in Jim Crow segregation led to the disparities in income and wealth that had tangible impacts in education systems. And so we want to think about what it means to chart those legacies materially and epistemologically as well. But in large part, we wanted to disrupt the notion that slavery could, one, be gotten over, two, that slavery's being gotten over was dependent upon Black people forgetting about slavery, forgiving about the sins of slavery, because slavery is an American problem and not just quote unquote a Black people's problem.
Right. And so one of the historical contexts we were writing in was really in thinking about the aftermath of the civil rights movement. And so many may recall when Barack Obama was elected, people saw it as a touch point or a culmination of some of the strivings of the civil rights movement. And certainly in the looking back on his presidency, we might draw into question that conclusion, but certainly Obama's presidency was a turning point in our history. And so it began a series of reflections about the impacts of the civil rights movement and the work that was yet to be done. And so the relationship that Robert is drawing in terms of thinking of a turning point in terms of desegregation or the lack of laws that require segregation, because we know that even though housing laws require people to not segregate anymore, we still live in a context of hyper-segregation at a material level in our communities, which is to say that even though you're not supposed to discriminate with regards to housing, most people live near people who look like them and who have the same wealth as them or the same amount of income as them. And so we still live in very hyper-segregated communities, and there are still laws in place that that diminish the wealth of certain people's property in neighborhoods, housing neighborhoods, and there's laws in place that help to accumulate wealth in terms of certain neighborhoods with regards to race. And so we were curious to think about the outcomes of the civil rights movement and the material ways that it manifested itself in a bigger picture, and how that was both part of representational economies, film, literature, music, as well as how it impacted in terms of systems. So the prison industrial complex, housing, education. And so I just want to say really briefly that one of the things that we've continued to think about after the publication of the book post 2016 is how slavery recurs in our public imagination, both in terms of popular culture, but then also in terms of the way that we experience life in the world as Black people. And so during the civil rights movement, I think a really important example of this is that we're often having to remind ourselves that just a few weeks after the March on Washington was the 16th Street church bombing. And so you have these moments in history that we often think of as triumphs of possibility and progress within American culture, but they're often shrouded by violence. And so the unfolding that we're seeing in the past 9 days with regards to George Floyd is just one example of how, on the one hand, one might argue that Obama's presidency was a moment of forward progress for American race relations, but then the backlash that we've seen over the last 3.5 years, evidences the ongoing legacy and histories of slavery. And that's not to suggest that those didn't exist during the Obama era, because I think that it's very clear that those also existed with the policing and the death of Black people during that time period. But it's to draw attention to the ongoing ways that racialized dynamics inform our world, and how there's a hyper realization of that in this particular moment this week.
Absolutely. And that the March on Washington was for jobs and economic freedom as well. And while we shorten it, I think it's an important point to make, because civil rights have always been tied to the amelioration of inequality and Black people's material lives, right? And so even Dr. King said something to the effect that a nation that has done something special against the Negro should do something special for it. And so thinking about what affirmative actions look like. And so this whole notion that that just removing inequality, or removing the inequalities that were the consequence of the law, could happen just by the law, seems to be somewhat short-sighted. And that seems to be one of the legacies that we are pushing back against in the volume. And so again, we're making connections that argue that slavery's legacies and the legacies of Jim Crow segregation persist into the 21st century, and outlining how they actually materialize. So I think now might be a good point if I talk about, in a more specific example, the argument I make about 12 Years a Slave. And then maybe Soyica, you could talk about Bamboozled, and then we can go through some of the other stuff before moving to some of our more explicit connections to the present moment. So in 12 Years a Slave, part of what I really want to push back at, and not only in this chapter, but in the work I'm doing on Black equity and the work I'm doing in Destructive Desires, are these persistent explanations for Black inequality that argue that it's Black people's behaviors that are the causes of and the solutions to their inequities. And those ideas take on a particular turn in the 1970s with the removal of explicit Jim Crow laws from the 1960s. And so I think that it's important to go back to 12 Years a Slave as an example of the long history of this practice to demonstrate it, but also to undercut the point. So in 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup is a free Black man who is living in Saratoga, New York, who gets duped by some duplicitous white men who invite him to Washington, D.C., where he is trying to be economically, self-sufficient, the American-made man. So he is making money by playing the violin. And long and the short is that they get him drunk and then they actually sell him into slavery. And so the narrative, I think, is fascinating for several reasons, because on the one hand, it posits Solomon Northup as an exceptional American, right? He is exceptional in the fact that he's a free Black man. He's exceptional in the fact that he is economically successful. And what I think is important about those points is that Solomon Northup is, quote unquote, doing what he's supposed to be doing, right? He's engaged in all of the norm accruing and norm producing behaviors, yet he still ends up sold into slavery. And so part of what's at stake here is that it's not that Solomon was doing what he was supposed to be doing or not doing what he was supposed to be doing. The issue is that you have structural racism that slavery is one manifestation of that actually allows him to be sold into chattel slavery. And then it's a very fascinating tale where he actually, ends up gaining his freedom again. But again, he gains his freedom because someone has to vouch for him, and he's actually returned to his family. And so the institution that allows for Black people to be chattel, although often operated mostly in the South, but we know from Dred Scott that it moves into the Midwestern territories, that is that very system that places Black success, that places Black life in a precarious situation. And so part of the point that I try to make in an essay is that, number one, these behavioral explanations of inequality fall short of getting to the superstructures that are really at the heart of the matter. So that's actually number one. The second thing that I want to make clear is that while viewers may go to the theater and say this is such a horrible, happening for someone like Northup, I think that the movie itself, for some of these broader issues it raises, can occasion the opportunity for us to think about, forget about Solomon Northup and that historical period being distant, but how do these explanations function in the present moment? Because after all, remember, Solomon Northup was doing what he was supposed to be doing, and he ended up sold into slavery. And I do think that is a resonant example that pushes back against these ideas of behavioral explanations and solutions for Black inequality.
And so in terms of, my contribution to the book and sort of just echoing some of the things that Robert was saying about exceptionalism and also this idea of when one is doing what one is supposed to be doing purportedly and how that enables or disables someone from moving past the legacies of slavery. One of the things that one of the things that we were trying to get at in the book was the question of the time period of slavery and how, some people have, Manning Marlborough, historian, has called the civil rights movement period the second Reconstruction. And so does slavery and its histories end when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued? Does it end once we have the Voting Rights Act? Does it end once we have Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation of schools? When do the legacies and histories of slavery end? And one of the things that we were trying to really tease out is, once again, how the history of slavery continues to recur. And so one of the predominant features of slavery is the fact that Black people have no rights under the law. And so then what does it mean when Black people still don't have access to equal protection under the law, even though we're purportedly in a time period where Black people, the ramifications of race have been lifted. And so in my chapter, I looked at the film Bamboozled by Spike Lee. And one of the things that's instructive about the film is it really focuses on intra-racial politics, giving us Black people from different socioeconomic classes, giving us Black people of different visual representations. And it really asks this question about whether or not Black people having access to capital will be a route for them to ascend from the vicissitudes of Black life more generally. And certainly if there was ever any question about that possibility, I think that that has been resolved in recent history. And by recent history, I mean the last 8 or 9 days, because it's clear that Black people are still subject to the same systems of domination, whether they be professors at Georgetown University or anyone else. And so one of the things that Bamboozle draws our attention to is that even as the main character, Pierre de la Cruz, tries to separate himself out from other Black people, he is still subject to the same visual representation that he tries to use to distance himself from Black people more generally. And so he's caught up into that same system that he tries to control. And so I think it begs us to consider politically, what does it mean to try to draw these divisions, and then also the utility of drawing such divisions. And so this is obviously a question that comes to the fore after the election of President Obama, and really thinking about how Black people might want to attenuate the hold of slavery by way of their ascension, by way of being exceptional, as Robert has already mentioned, and how those ideas that are deeply American ideas are limited and problematic, we would argue, and we want to consider what other types of thriving and what other types of freedom dreaming we might imagine that might allow for a more robust understanding of Black life more generally, and are not tied to individual achievement.
Right, and absolutely. And so this issue, so there's this issue. So that's what one of the issues is that we really end up focusing on. And so what we then do, so my chapter is about cinematic adaptations. Soyica's chapters deal with satire. We have poetry. Some of the authors deal with poetry that's thinking about the legacies of slavery. We have diasporic representations in there too, thinking about the French Revolution and its relationship to slavery psychic holds. We think about dramatic performances in the context of the United States. And so there are a range of types of representation, but if there is a tilt in the volume does tilt predominantly toward manifesting the fact that slavery and its legacies matter, with the exception of one essay that is perhaps an outlier in that way, in that the thinking calls into question perhaps some of the parallels between enslavement and the contemporary moment. But the reality, I do think, is that those continuities actually persist. And one of the contemporary examples, and by contemporary, I'm going to echo what Soyica has said here, meaning in the last 9 days, is that throughout history, Black people's relationship to the law has had a paradox, because on the one hand, part of the movements toward inclusion are fighting for our personhoods to be protected by the law, and in the same breath, we've been fighting to be protected from the law, right? And with police in particular, if you think about, so one of the cases that I make in the epilogue to the book is that it's these ideas about Blackness and anti-Black racism that are deeply rooted in the structures that slavery, made possible, but certainly did not originate, that become very important and that end up recurring throughout history. And so an example that I use is when the police officer in Texas, Brian Encinia, the Texas State Trooper, says to Sandra Bland, "I'm going to light you up," before he tases her. And part of how that language of lighting you up can conjure up a history of lynching, because lynching was also a police form of extrajudicial state murders, right? And so there's the lynching specifically involving the killing and hanging and then mutilation of Black people's genitals as a part of it, and the burning of their bodies. And then there is the idea that that happens because there are some random people who have taken the law into their hand. But an important part of that story, I think, is worth considering is that sometimes these people didn't just necessarily go into people's homes to murder Black people. Some of these people went to the jails where they were already being detained, and the jail sort of participated in the process of turning them over to the lynch mobs. And so when we think about Black people's relationship to the police, these ideas of racism, why Black people may be skeptical about policing, these histories, we think, are significant in that conversation.
Right, and so our volume focuses on a set of cultural productions, like we said, film, theater, literature, poetry, that emerged in the early aughts that specifically take up the idea of slavery. And we were really curious about cultural producers' interest in slavery and this real explosion of work on the subject of slavery. But I think we would also, in the aftermath of the book, be interested in thinking about other modes of cultural production that don't seem, Black cultural production, that don't seem to be focused on slavery per se, but actually are focused more on its legacies. And so Ava DuVernay's 13th is an example of a film that we teach when we're teaching about the psychic holds of slavery. And I would also, draw our attention to, there was an episode of Grey's Anatomy where Miranda Bailey, the Black woman, one of the Black women doctors, appeared at the hospital, was having what appeared to be heartburn, and we know that she ended up having a heart attack, but the physicians didn't believe that she was actually having a heart attack because she didn't present in a way in which a heart attack normally presents. And so instead of calling a cardiologist, the doctors called a psychiatrist. And so this is an important example, I think, in popular culture of the ways that Black people's bodies, Black people are not believed, Black people's have to advocate for themselves in healthcare, and the ongoing understanding of Black people's relationship to structures. We can think again about the higher rates of Black women who die in childbirth. We can obviously think about the way that COVID has manifested and has a disproportionate impact on Black communities. And all of these things are not related to Black people's poor decision making, but rather the ways in which Black people engage with structures that already understand them as being dehumanized, unbelievable, not worthy of care. And so this is the connection that we were making to the history and legacies of slavery, this idea of Black people not having the same human rights and access to rights that the rest of Americans have. And so when we think about how they manifest in terms of structures, when one is already outside of what we understand as being human, as being worthy of care, as being believable, when George Floyd is dying and he's saying, "I can't breathe," the fact that the police officers find that to be unquestionable, I think is a really resonant example of the dynamic that we're trying to think through.
Right. And also the resistance towards shifting to those type of epistemologies, right? So back to Soyica's example of Miranda Bailey on Grey's Anatomy. I think that that's such a resonant example because it coincides with the argument about Solomon Northup. So Miranda Bailey, she is a doctor, right? She probably knows the signs, right, of what a heart attack looks like, and she's still not believed. So even when Black people have access to the quality of healthcare that we might want, that high quality healthcare, it is still that interaction, the human interaction, that also presents, some of these barriers. And I just think that it's so important, particularly as it relates to COVID-19, something that I've talked to Soyica about offline, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it here, is that it irks me to no end when I watch some reporting and they'll talk about, there was a party of a lot of Black people in, I think it was Daytona area, something in Chicago, and then people correlate that to COVID-19. The thing that irks me about that is that that's an easier behavioral explanation about how COVID-19 could spread in that community. But these disproportionate rates of COVID-19 have to do with these other interrelated structural inequalities and employment, where Black people are in the service sectors that are essential and interacting with people more. It has to do with poverty that has resulted sometimes in Black people living intergenerationally within households and therefore not able to sequester themselves even though they're having these other interactions. And I think that those distinctions are important. Another good show in popular culture that tries to attend to this is the it's Blackish on ABC as well. And so that whole line of programming, thinking about the histories and how they matter, how they don't matter, and how economic class plays with some of those issues too, would be a resonant example as well.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to highlight the context that relate to people being at disproportionate risk with regards to COVID and how that maps into racial categories. And so certainly when we're thinking about the impacts and the histories of slavery, it's not unrelated to the ways that the disease is manifesting itself. And so I think one of the things that's really heartbreaking about this moment is the coincidence of these two histories coming to bear. And you know, we had a conversation yesterday, or I should say I had the pleasure of hosting a conversation where Robert and several other faculty from Georgetown were presenting some ideas around the relationship between COVID and Minneapolis. And I think one of the things that we learned in that conversation is really how to think in terms of structures is important. And so, Robert, I don't know if you want to talk some about the difference between thinking in terms of individual action and structures and what we mean specifically when we use the term structural racism.
So, yes, I've been talking much about this lately, and so let me go on here. So one of the courses that I teach is Race and Racism in American Culture. And I've also had the opportunity to teach a course, a similar course on race and racism that really focused on in the criminal justice system. And oftentimes, I think part of the problem of understanding racism, of understanding structural racism, and quite frankly, developing appropriate solutions that can begin to eat away at these structures, it has to do with definitions. And so oftentimes, it has been my experience in my reading and scholarship that the terms of racism are often thought of as, you know, one group thinks that it is superior to another group based on race, right? As a baseline definition. But what I'd like to talk about is anti-Black racism, because what I really want to think about is how, you know, not other groups, I want to think about how, you know, white supremacy works against Black people. And so rather than think about racism as an, you know, one-time event that an individual intentionally commits that's overt and conscious, while that's important, it's important to think about racism as a part of a larger constellation of ideas, right? Discourses, representations that are embedded throughout our different institutions of society, be it the government, be it schools, be it housing policies, and how those ideas work to disadvantage Black people while advantaging white people, and that they are embedded in institutions such that they operate irrespective of who is present. And I think that is important because it takes away the idea that racism primarily lies in individuals. It also adds to the conversation that power, systemic power, is significant to racism functioning on a daily basis across history and throughout time. And I think I just think that is an important point to make about racism. And so, as an example, you know, we could talk about schools and the discrepancy that happens in, you know, wealthier areas and less wealthy areas, and that happens along racial lines. But there's no way to have that conversation with any substance without going back to housing policies and how schools are funded and the role that the government and localities had in suburbanizing areas and then transferring money out of those urban areas with those people and, you know, to the suburbs. There's no way to have that conversation. There's no way to really address those issues without having those larger conversations. And it's easier to talk about, oh, well, somebody chose to live in this place. This person should have made better decisions in school. And I think that that's just short-sighted, and it actually, unfortunately, reinforces structural racism and assaults on Black humanity in an unhelpful way.
Right, and so I think we can turn to our questions in a minute, but I just wanted to echo a point that you just made about the interrelation between housing and education. And so as we mentioned earlier, just looking at demographics, most people live in neighborhoods with people of similar race and a similar economic background, which then informs the schools that their children go to if they go to public schools and you're going to schools at a neighborhood level. And so if there are structures in place that disproportionately benefit certain communities with regard to the funding for their schools, that'll also map along racial lines. And then we also know that just in terms of loans and getting access to housing, that certain neighborhoods, there are better loan rates because they're designated safer than others. And this is how redlining works. And so there's also a disproportionate disadvantage in that case. And so these are structural things when you're thinking about lending rates, when you're thinking about how different neighborhoods are designated in terms of investment. And so there's not a way to behave yourself out of those dynamics. However, we often tell our students that it's important to understand that individual people are helping to rethink and redefine policy. And so there is a way to intervene in structures, and that is where we hope to encourage more activity. And so the example of Bamboozled and the example that we make in the introduction to the book, where we're thinking about this idea of exceptionalism and individual achievement, sometimes falls short if you're not thinking about how that relates to reforming larger ongoing structures and policies.
And that having these type of conversations will serve you well when you're in those discussions, because you can ask some of these questions and interrogate some of those assumptions and try to push the needle on it too. So we're going to answer as many questions as possible. I have the distinct pleasure of reading the questions this afternoon, so I'm going to begin with the first one. Would you view this moment in American history, characterized by unambiguous white backlash, as aligning with the cycles we've experienced since the promise of Reconstruction and redemption segregation and the Civil Rights Movement, followed by Republican conservatism? If so, what unique circumstances in the present moment might allow us to interrupt that pattern?
So one of the things that has was stated in the conversation that we hosted yesterday at Georgetown for the College of Arts and Sciences, which was about the relationship between from COVID to Minneapolis, structures of racism, was the context for that conversation. One of the things that we talked about, or the panelists talked about, I should say, is the broad-based coalition of people that have come out to protest against the killing of George Floyd. And so one of the things that I think is important is thinking about how young people, once again, are at the forefront of change in America, which has historically been the case, but how in this case we see Black people, white people, transgender people, men and women, all out advocating for what they understand, and which we all saw with our eyes, the murder of George Floyd. And so that collectivity, I think, is a distinguishing characteristic of this coalition if we're comparing it to what was happening in 1968, for example. And of course, the other part which makes this moment particularly troubling, but then also perhaps there might be something we can learn, is the ongoing pandemic and the fact that we have depression level rates of unemployment. And so the coincidence of all those factors, I think, make this moment distinctive from anyone that we've seen before. And it puts pressure in terms of unemployment on how we might organize ourselves economically, which has been an ongoing pressure point, I think, in the 21st century about the increase in the wealth gap and how we might redress that to reclaim the middle class for America. And so I think that this moment provides an opportunity for us to really come to grips with the disproportionate amount of wealth in a few Americans versus the large wealth disparity from the most of us.
And I would add to that I do think that the white backlash at this moment is magnified because there is a clear assault on civil rights under this current administration. From the rolling back of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, to the rolling back of civil rights protection in HUD, to the election of judges, not the election, the appointment of federal judges who won't affirm that Brown versus Board of Ed is, law that's not debatable. to the cases about voting rights, there is a clear assault right now on civil rights. And quite frankly, if Brown versus Board of Ed were again headed to the Supreme Court now, we might be in trouble because I could see an opposite 5-4 ruling that it had in 1953. And I think there's evidence that suggests that. I raise that point to say the energy that I see is refreshing to what Soyica said. And it is also important to keep that energy mobilized in November, because the reality of it is that there are long-term consequences at stake. So I really appreciate what Melvin Carter in Minneapolis has been saying when he's been responding to the consciousness-raising activities in the streets, which is that you have a valid point. We understand your frustration, your pain, and we need to have conversations and figure out a path forward. That's very different than denying that one should be out there or telling people, don't protest, vote. Protest and vote.
Right.
Because you have to make those changes in the systems as well.
Right. And just, quickly, I know we need to move on to the next question, but I would just say that the other piece, as Robert has already articulated, just to echo about the backlash, is really thinking about the erosion of the press as well, and the assault on the press. And we see this in a physical way in the protests when members of the press are being assaulted, but then also the overall questioning of the validity of the press and how important it is to understand the press as a part of a functioning democracy.
Absolutely. Okay, it seems that many conversations about slavery leave out the history of Native Indigenous peoples. Is it incorrect or even wrong or in an ethical or moral sense to think that two histories have an overlap and that that should be highlighted?
Right. So I think it's important and necessary to think about the relationship between the history of Indigenous people.
You know what? I'm sorry. I wasn't supposed. That question was taken back. But go ahead, Ann. I'm sorry. See, this is why it's probably bad to have me managing this. But go ahead. So the person who asked the question.
Well, I think it was a great question. And I think the history should be thought together as a short answer to the question.
Right. And so part of what we weren't trying to do, we acknowledge and aware of that, but we were trying to have a specific history, if that's helpful. Okay. Regarding whether we should continue to discuss the issue or keep quiet, there are a number of philosophical parallels with Jews and the Holocaust. There's a powerful essay on Jews being forgiven for the atrocity of the Holocaust by British writer. Okay, that's giving us some information that we could put on the thing we're going to send out, the reading list, or there's an email that comes out after this, and so we'll be able to put that link on there.
Oh, wonderful.
How do we get at superstructures, though? It is such an ingrained system. Where do you start? So go ahead, Soyica.
I think that one of the things we have to be careful about in our language is that although we are not suggesting that individual behavior produce racism, for example, or produce racial disenfranchisement, for example, we also are aware that individual people participate in reproducing systems, right? And so thinking about how behavior is feeding into a longer history and longer structure is what we are trying to emphasize. And so I think that is the piece that is difficult to parse sometimes. And so we're thinking about superstructures, we're thinking about how our society is organized by laws, we're thinking about how our society is organized economically. And so in our current moment, I would encourage people to read Saidiya Hartman's new book, Wayward Lives, because one of the things that it talks about is mutual aid societies that were in existence in the United States that helped to benefit Black people. And the reason why I think it's an important book for us to consider in this moment is because there are other economies, for example, that have organized the United States, even as capitalism has been the dominant way we organize our world, a superstructure. And so what does it mean to start to participate in economies of care? What does it mean to start to participate in economies of mutuality, even as the superstructure exists? And what type of possibilities do those economies create as we continue to invest in them and divest from capitalism, for example? So that would be one concrete example I could offer.
Yeah, I would add to that only to say that, again, thinking about how we as individuals have power and influence in certain arenas where we might enact that change. And so, there's the political sphere, which may seem out, too far out. But then there's interpersonal relationships. So when we make some of these assumptions about why one group may lag behind another group in certain statistics or certain markers, why might that actually be the case? And when we hear these conversations kind of push back, when we see certain representations in the media, for example, not take them to be truth or for granted, more generally having a hermeneutics of suspicion might be a way to govern ourselves, because it can force us to ask more complicated questions to get us at, answers that could really push at the heart of the issue, which is, I think, oftentimes is not the case. Okay, oh yes, this is a good one too. What would be the best outcome of today's riots and protests? Police protocol changes, legislative changes, a vote for Biden? D, all of the above.
I agree. The best outcome will be all of the above. And that is the point. We have to be thinking about all these things together. I know I'm cutting you off, Robert.
No, I think that question gets to it, right? So I'm gonna say a couple of things about this matter. So police protocol changes. So Paul Butler, one of our colleagues at the law school, has a book entitled Chokehold, which it was very relevant before. It is exceptionally relevant now. And part of the argument that he makes in the book is that the chokehold actually is operating the way it was designed to. And I think that's something to think about and to meditate on for a little bit. So that's worth thinking about. So the San Diego Police Department has outlawed the chokehold. So that's good. Another tangible outcome would be a broader conversation about excessive force. Perhaps a more narrow set of circumstances, if any, what types of excessive force are permissible. The rethinking about how police departments are funded, in addition to demilitarizing police departments. So in Los Angeles today, the activists, they made some strides, and they are supposedly going to recommit money that was supposed to go to LAPD back into some of these community institutions that have been eroded over time, because money has been shifted from education, community centers, employment opportunities such as Job Corps to policing. And so that was a good outcome to see. How do you shift the culture of policing? That's a big one that people may not be up for. But any reading of the Justice Department's report on Baltimore City Police Department or Ferguson's police department in light of the Freddie Gray and Michael Brown murders will reveal that the culture of policing in those departments in general, those departments in particular, and it seems though from what people are reporting, can be more generalized, they are predicated on the criminalization of Blackness and Black people and anti-Black racism. And so pulling back some of that implicit and explicit bias in policing would just be some ways to start, which would be monumental task as well.
Right. We often give the example that one of the revelations, perhaps, of Michael Brown's death was really the reporting on Ferguson that happened thereafter, because one of the things we learned is about the systematic policing of Black people in Ferguson, Missouri. And so Michael Brown's death was predictable and realizable based on the dynamic that had been created over time by the police force. And so one of the things that we can think about is not how these moments erupt onto the scene, but how there's a foundation laid on a daily basis that provides the opportunity for these tragedies to occur. And so attending to that daily harassment, that daily policing that's happening to law-abiding citizens for the most part is an important part of rethinking structures. And the other piece that I'll just say, and I know the question was asking us to create a hierarchy, but I think it's important to note that during civil rights history, we often think about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as an example of someone who was working somewhat in the system and someone who was working outside and putting pressure on the government, and how that was able to enact change. But I also like the example of Lorraine Hansberry, who famously met with Bobby Kennedy, and she was invited to meet with Bobby Kennedy along with James Baldwin and several other well-known African Americans because of their fame. But what Hansberry said to the Attorney General is, you need to be paying attention to those students down in Birmingham not to these esteemed Black people. And so she used her platform to redirect the attention of the Attorney General to what was happening in the streets and the protests that were happening around civil rights. And so we need to, and so I use that as an example to draw attention to the multiplicity of strategies that have to work together for us to see social change.
Right, and I'm gonna go here a little more into what Soyica said and say a couple other things. And so this issue about the daily harassment of Black people, from fines, from tickets, right, to the system uncovered all of the quotidian ways in which the police department was harassing Black people to recover revenue because they felt like they needed revenue to over police. And so it was this circular movement. But the important thing about that particular example relates to the next part of this question, which has to do with policy, with protocol changes, legislative changes. So getting in the system makes a difference. So after the district attorney, or maybe in that particular county it's called something else, but it means the district attorney, after he failed to bring charges, one of the Black Lives Matter activists ran against him and won, and now occupies that position. So that position is important because the district attorney, as we saw in that case, decides who brings charges and who do not bring charges, who doesn't bring charges. And so if Black people could stop entering the criminal justice system because they would not be harassed under prosecutorial discretion, that right there goes a long way in sort of lessening Black people's interaction with that system. And as far as the vote for Biden goes, whether somebody's a Democrat and Biden was that person's choice initially or not, to me, is irrelevant. Part of what's at stake now is what is the long-term plan for the future of this country? For me as a Black person, for Black people, in particular too, and other underrepresented and underserved populations. And can we see beyond these 3 or 4 years? Because something I will say, while I do think that Donald Trump is more emblematic of his party and some of their views than people would perhaps care to admit publicly, I do think that people also saw, okay, he's here, we're going to get certain things that we want. We want a conservative judiciary. We'll get that. So we'll put up with the other things. So I really think about in this vote, it is thinking about what's at stake, what do I value, and what do I think should be the long-term vision of the country, even if a candidate doesn't necessarily, generate firecrackers in my spirit. Let's see. For academic, it would benefit from, okay, that is helpful to know. They want a little less, that was an observation that we had a little bit of academic jargon. So that, let's see, we got that. What steps as individuals to unlearn these behaviors? Some examples of structural racism, I think we've given some of those. Are there any areas where significant advances have been made in structural racism? So,
I think so. I mean, I think that, the Voting Rights Act, the civil rights legislation was a key turning point. And I wouldn't want to leave with the misrepresentation that nothing has changed since the 19th century for Black people. Certainly, Robert and I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for the civil rights movement. There's a direct parallel between both of us having access to Georgetown as undergraduates, one, and then being able to return to teach here, two, as a result of the civil rights movement. Melissa Harris Perry has said the best time in the world to be a Black girl is to be, born in the 1970s. And so, I was on the tail end of that. And I think the point that she made in that comment is that there was this window of opportunity that was opened up by the civil rights movement, gaining access to institutions for Black women in particular and Black people more broadly, that then enabled a Black middle class to emerge and to thrive. And so certainly that's distinctive from this period. I just think that we can't lose sight of the ways that those gains are always under threat, and how much more work we have to do to make the playing field accessible, not just for a few exceptional, quote unquote, exceptional Black people, but rather make it universally accessible for all.
Yes, just a point of reference in case people, there's not a question here, it's a critique that sort of deals with what this person says about us using, quote, Spike Lee, providing definitive insight rather than rigorous scholarship. But I think that we're making a case about the importance of the humanities and thinking about equality, not consigning that to social science. And we're actually the ones who are producing the scholarship on that. And I do think that the book is diasporically thinking, but in any case, that was one of the questions that it had many questions in it too. So someone asked, so I think that we've had some conversation about this. What is your view on Joe Biden's comment? Well, I tell you what, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or for Trump, then you ain't black.
First of all, I think it was unfortunate. I think that he, said it as a part of a larger conversation, and perhaps in being too overfamiliar with Black people and his position in relationship to Black people. I do think, though, that there is something fundamentally, one can search one's own soul to think about voting for someone as a Black person or as an American more broadly who is willing to have American citizens pepper sprayed for expressing their First Amendment rights to protest on the street in Washington, D.C. so they can cross the street for a photo op. And I think that that has to do with Blackness in the sense that it's an assault on our civil rights. And so as much as Black people have fought to expand the access to civil rights in general, I do think that there's something to be said and something to question about how political affiliation is aligned with one's own investment in maintaining certain rights.
Yeah, I would add to that, and just as a point of reference, we are going to be closing out in a second because we got to be respectful of your time, and we are approaching the 4 o'clock hour. But the comment, I thought a couple of things about it to be quite honest with you and frank. First of all, the interview was really good with Charlemagne, and so the unfortunate part of the comment is that this is what the headlines ran off with. But I do think that when you have the Trump campaign tweeting that something was racist, that should be startling to you to actually look at the interview in its entirety. Because if they're calling out racism, then that should be eyebrow raising, I think. But I do think that with Joe Biden, not the surface of what he's saying, but I think that with the substance of what he's saying about you have two people on the ballot, and when you're comparing the records on where they've been and where you think that they might go, have the potential to go, even if you don't like where they've been, but where they have the potential to go, I think that there's a clear answer there. Someone recommended that you all read the op-ed by Juan Williams on Black voters are going Trump's way or something. So if that's of interest to you, you might be able to read that too. Some of the other questions, I'm just going to read these. These are some of the issues that we do take up in the volume, but we're not going to take up now because we are at the end. The legacy of Jim Crow, how they negatively impact Black communities today. That might be something that we got to. So part of what I don't see on these questions are the timestamps. So the question may have been asked at an earlier point then, and then we may have come to it. So we want to thank you for being here with us today. We know that there are many other places that you could have been. We hope that the views have been enlightening, and that while we may not necessarily agree on some of the specifics, that they might give you different ways to engage with some of the text and think about possible paths forward. I think we're invested in movements towards equity. I think that there are many ways to achieve that. And so getting like-minded and not like-minded people together might be a path in that direction.
Right, and so we're grateful for you tuning in today. We hope that you enjoyed the conversation. We look forward to being in further conversation with you as a part of the Georgetown alumni community, but also as a part of the university. So thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thanks, we appreciate you.
Bye.